How y'all doing? It's Global Politics with Jim Martin. Today, I wanted to talk about supply chains and international economics. Why should we care about that? It's a really tough topic. It's very complicated. There's a myriad of people and businesses and banks and regulations and all sorts of things interacting, even things like the weather, that interact to affect how this huge complex system works. I decided that in order to explain it a little bit better, I would use something that I'm familiar with, and that's guitars. This is a 1973 Fender Stratocaster. It's composed of wood, metal, electronics, plastics, finishes. At one point, there would be a factory, which was in Fullerton, California, and they would have acquired the raw materials to put this thing together. And in the factory itself, they would have had luthiers and electronics people and woodworkers and people who understood how to work with metal and all sorts of things. And they would have essentially built this entire guitar in one place in Fullerton, California. Sometimes they would use woods from foreign countries, but mostly woods from the United States and woods from Canada. Sometimes, occasionally, they might get rosewood or other hardwoods from South America or other countries like that. But more often than not, like this one, which is made out of maple, they would have got that in the United States or Canada. This could really be firmly declared as this is a made in the United States product. Now, during the 70s and into the 80s, which was sort of a rough time for guitar and a bit of a rough time economically for folks, you began to see outsourcing. And this is coinciding with a lot of people outsourcing a lot of different sorts of manufacturing. The reason that companies would do that in the United States, labor costs were higher than they were in other countries. Companies began to outsource various elements of guitars. For instance, one of the first things began to happen is that you might outsource the electronics, the pickups, the capacitors, the potentiometers, the wiring. Various fabricated pieces of the guitar might be outsourced to other countries. That was done to reduce the overall cost of the guitar for Fender so that they could sell it and make a little bit more money and avoid paying those high labor costs. They could get rid of the highly skilled labor folks and rely more on people who could just assemble things. It could go for any manufacturer in a large industrialized economy like the United States. Oh, and I should mention also that many guitar companies at that time even had, bargain brands with the full name on them, entry-level priced guitars like Fenders that were just without all the bells and whistles on them and things like that, or subsidiary brands that were truly inexpensive, like Squire in Fender's case or Epiphone in Gibson's case, but again, could be anybody. Those would be entirely made in different countries under license to particular countries. And so you could have Stratocasters made in Mexico or Japan, different instruments made in Indonesia, Vietnam, China. You might think, wow, okay, so now you're going to produce these things, and I get it that they're cheaper, but the shipping costs, that's got to be insane, right? During this late 60s, early 70s into the 80s period, you began to see the rise of container ships. And we've all seen these. I've got a picture up now of a container ship that have those huge 40-foot by 12-foot or whatever it is, giant metal containers that they stuff full of whatever it is and then ship it across the ocean. With these supply chains developing as they did, you would have perhaps one element being produced in mass quantities in this particular country, then moving down to this other country where it might be assembled into part of it, then it would move on to another place, and then finally be finished in the United States. You've got these, entry-level, inexpensive guitars being entirely produced somewhere else through a supply chain within that region, and then brought to the United States, where they're then distributed out to stores like mom and pops or big chain stores like Guitar Center or whatever, and then sold to consumers. Thousands and thousands of these big container ships are plying the seas at any moment of any day, year-round. And this has been going on for decades now. If you Google this, there's all these real-time maps where you can track shipping. Just about any industrialized country, Japan, Vietnam, China, any economy of any size, whether it be under an authoritarian regime or a democracy, depends on this system working. One other aspect of why the shipping system works is when you think about how huge those ships are and what it costs per container to move goods. It's really very surprising. So let's just consider our guitar example again. Let's say that you have pickups that are made in a different country. To have them produced there, lower labor costs, you're paying less for the actual item, and then you're loading them on a ship, and you're putting thousands and thousands and thousands of pickups, perhaps you're using them on a range of your brands, into a container and shipping it. One container costs something like, depending on how far it has to go, $2,500 to $4,000 to ship that container. When you split that up amongst thousands and thousands of pickups that might be stuffed into maybe a third of a container, it's less than a cent per item. These are efficient. What does that depend on? First off, this is a post-World War II phenomenon, in that at the close of World War II, all the European countries were devastated. Russia was devastated, and the United States was not, and remained a powerful economic force. Pretty much everywhere else was not yet developing. They did not have modern economies. They basically were subsistence agriculture and selling raw materials to people. That's about it. Oil, wood, other extractive type things like mining, things like that. Very little, but very little finished manufactured goods. In that period of time, because of the experiences of the two world wars, people came together and said, look, one of the central causes of both of these wars is economic inequality among countries. And that fear of not having resources, and frankly, of not being able to feed your people, has led to economic instability and wars that threaten to devastate the entire globe. And now we got nuclear weapons, and this is a real problem. That's the altruistic side of this argument. This system that evolved, devised by the major victorious powers in World War II, the United States, France, Britain, China, Russia, was to create this buy-in, or at least a tacit acceptance, of the source and destination countries that would be doing manufacturing in the future. It required buy-in from developing countries to allow folks to come there, invest in various enterprises, and extract resources, but also to have access to those markets as they grew, so that you could go there and sell Coca-Cola or French wines or British automobiles or whatever it happened to be. All of that was secured under the US Navy. So the US Navy at that time was the largest Navy in the world by far, probably by a factor of 15 or 20. US Navy would patrol the sea lanes, head off things like piracy. That system is what really led to a gigantic explosion in economic development around the world, and frankly, enabled a massive population explosion as well. Because if you have enough food to feed your people, then people tend to live longer and all these things. Now, I realize that globalization to some is a dirty word. In any system like this, there's going to be winners and losers, and the effects are going to be uneven. Some places it's going to be way better, other places it's not going to be great. That can happen within single countries too. Sometimes a particular region would do very well, other times another region might languish for a variety of reasons. This is what emerged in the late 50s into the 60s, into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and up until close to the present day. However, at this point, that system is wobbly. All we have to think about is COVID. These huge seaports where these kinds of products are moved from manufacturing centers, like say in China, to docks, loaded up onto these container ships and then sent out, were basically shut down for a period of time or operating at severely reduced capacities. The same thing is happening in the United States and other industrialized countries where at first, at least, and for some time, there was a lot of disruption because we couldn't get the people to do the things that we needed them to do because of lockdowns and all kinds of other stuff. That's one aspect of vulnerability. The impact of COVID in terms of disruptions to those supply routes only lasted for about 2 or 3 months, really, before kind of things sorted out. Yet the disruptive waves that emerged from that have been reverberating up to and including today. Now, we also have to think about things like years ago, the Somali pirates, and the forcefulness of the response of a variety of countries that had navies to that threat. Huge, right? Seems like a lot for some dudes on speedboats. You know what I'm saying? However, those dudes on speedboats taking over the occasional tanker ship or container ship cost a lot of money. More recently, the Houthis shooting up tankers, very forceful response from the US Navy, the British, I think a couple other navies too. It's in the interest of everyone to protect those. However, the US Navy is not the biggest Navy anymore, and in fact, it has contracted to some degree. Building aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers and all of the things that you need to kind of cover all those bases are really, really expensive. And at the same time, the threat matrix against those as a potential has risen quite dramatically. If we consider the war in Ukraine and how the Ukrainians have driven the Russian Black Sea fleet completely out of the Black Sea, and it's like hiding in a couple of ports as far away from that as they can get, because they're within range of drones, cruise missiles, and everything else. And on the other hand, how the world reacted when the Russians shot up a few Ukrainian container ships full of grain. Disruptions to the supply chain of food, of which Ukraine produces a ton of grain, was such a threat that even the Russians agreed after a while to back off. These kinds of things are only growing when you consider China and its utter reliance on petrochemicals imported from the Middle East, an unstable region anyway. They're extremely dependent on that because they have no real oil and natural gas resources of their own. They have to import almost all of their oil and natural gas from other countries. And so it goes on ships that go very slow, and they work their way up through those straits and, along the coasts until they get to those ports. Those are extremely vulnerable. They know this. They also know that the United States is no longer fully capable of defending all of those sea lanes to prevent piracy or the random missile attack or an enemy of China. Let's just throw out India as a potential, who also has a big navy, to threaten those in a time of geopolitical crisis. It's also unsurprising why they would build those barrier islands that they've been doing, where they dig up the seafloor and pile sand for years until they actually achieve an island and build a military base on it. in order to secure the oil and natural gas fields that are offshore in the South China Sea and elsewhere. Puts a little bit of a different spin on it when you think of the threat that they would be under if there was to be even just an economic oil embargo against China. It would devastate their economy. They have some aggressive intentions that are buried within that also, but that's a good reason to do what they're doing. Consider what a wider European war would do to these trade routes and supply chains. There are plenty of large container ship ports. I've got a picture up of one that is in Long Beach. It's one of the biggest ones in the world. There are many of these around the world. There's big ports in Bremen and other places in Europe, many of these in China, of course, several in the United States. Every major industrialized country that is on an ocean has one of these, and they cost billions of dollars. Imagine what a wider European war might do to those trade routes and those ports. Imagine what a war between the United States and China would do to those ports and those trade routes and everything else. It would be a disaster that would probably lead to a global depression. Companies obviously are facing higher insurance rates also to carry goods through particular stretches of oceans that are riskier and more threat prone. We've talked about the potential for how the global supply chains and the economy was disrupted under COVID, and the potentials for larger scale regional or worldwide conflicts on what could happen to supply chains and international trade. This isn't something that companies are unaware of. The governments of countries like Germany, like the United States, like Canada, like China, like Japan are certainly aware of this also. And that's why over the past 10 to 15 years, you've begun to see manufacturing that is brought back to the United States. More recently, during the Biden administration, we have the CHIPS Act, which is attempting to incentivize a lot more chip manufacturing companies to either move to the United States or for US companies to develop that capacity. We used to make a lot of chips, but we don't do that anymore because we outsourced all that because it was cheaper to do it that way. Under that system, it made sense. Now it doesn't make so much sense. So you're beginning to see the reshoring of a lot of manufacturing. And this has been going on for a while. This isn't just a Donald Trump wish list item. It's been happening really since the Obama administration is when it kind of started. Reshoring means that you're going to have these sorts of manufacturing plants and things like that on US soil, which is great because then your supply chains become a lot more secure. However, you're going to have higher labor costs because the US labor market is what it is, and you're going to pay more for highly skilled labor to make those things. These are much higher than what you would pay if you were doing this in Vietnam or China or Indonesia, places like that. What does this all mean? It means that as this proceeds, you're going to have naturally inflation. Prices will rise as a result of this reshoring effort. Tariffs will certainly also increase costs because then we won't be able to export as much as we once had because countries will retaliate against us for the tariffs that we put in place. That's going to contribute a percentage of inflation. I saw something today like a basic set of the tariffs that Trump has proposed could cost us something between $1,000 to $2,000 per citizen. And that's just the basic set of things that he's talked about with China. We don't really know what kind of tariffs he's proposing to impose on European countries, Canada and Mexico. Canada and Mexico are our two largest trading partners. That could be quite difficult and could raise inflation even beyond that. We're entering into an entirely different world where the United States is no longer securing the sea lanes of the world, where globalization is drawing to a close and contracting where buy-in for a lot of countries is disappearing, and the willingness of large industrialized economies to take that risk is really lessening day by day. So we're entering into a difficult, uncertain time. To use kind of a cheesy phrase, we're going into uncharted waters on a lot of this, and there'll be pirates out there. Thank you for checking this out. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Comments are welcome, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Have a great one.